This is the Amazing Education Podcast. Powered by the Ames Community School District, I'm your host, Eric Smith. On today's episode, we are joined by Ames High teacher James Webb. We're going to have an amazing conversation about the process that he went through to be a national board-certified teacher and how it reignited his passion for teaching. James Webb, thank you for being on this episode of the Amazing Education Podcast. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Yeah, thanks for having me.
I'm really excited about this. I'm not going to lie. So I'm going to start by saying congratulations to you.
Thank you.
National Board Certified Teacher.
Yeah.
There's a lot of work that goes into this, isn't there?
It was a lot of work. I think maybe more than I knew going into it even, but it was a good experience.
So I've done a little bit of research on this, but honestly, not a lot. So I do have a lot of questions about this. This is a pretty grueling process. This semester, you did become National Board Certified. So I want to talk through that process. And before we get that, I'm gonna read a quote on what is on their website. So it says, National Board Certification is a comprehensive process developed by teachers to recognize, reward, inspire, and grow accomplished teachers across America. So now I want you to tell us, what is a National Board Certified Teacher, and talk us a little bit through that process.
Yeah. It kind of breaks down teaching into its most fundamental elements, and it kind of asks you to go through and explore the way that you go about being a teacher, the things that you do. There's 5 core propositions. I brought them here because I don't have them memorized. But it starts with 1, teachers are committed to students and their learning. 2, teachers know the subjects they teach and how to teach those subjects to students. 3, teachers are responsible for managing and monitoring student learning. 4, teachers think systematically about their practice and learn from experience. And Proposition 5, teachers are members of learning communities. And so it asks you to kind of be intentional and reflective about all of those, and then you kind of have to show how you are proficient and proficient practitioner of all of those different propositions.
So we're going to get into some of those, and I have written down here some components as well that you had to demonstrate. But how long has this been on your mind? What you had to make a decision and say, you know what, I want to go through this process. I want to learn. I want to submit and organize my materials in order to do that. I mean, how long have you been thinking about this? And then what finally made you say, you know what, let's do it? Because you have to commit.
Yeah, you're right.
You can't go softly into this.
No, I've been thinking about it for years, honestly. I had some friends that had gone through it. I have a friend that's on kind of the executive board with that.
Okay.
And so she'd been bugging me about it forever. And I honestly, I was kind of getting to that point in my career where kind of maybe that midlife crisis, is this what I want to do the rest of my life, or is it time to regroup and look in a different direction? And so that's kind of what I was wrestling with. And I felt like I was very dissatisfied. I felt like very stale as a teacher. And I knew the things that I was doing were, they were effective to a point, but I just felt like I could be better. And all my learning was just, I didn't feel like I was in control of everything I was learning about myself and about teaching. And so I decided to go ahead and commit to it. And it was a 2-year process. Yeah. And it was great. It was very worthwhile.
So how long have you been teaching?
24 years, I think.
Yeah. So those feelings and stuff that you had, was it just a result of when you've been in a position, you kind of was like, all right, we're doing it again, and then you get to this unit, or were you having that feeling? Is that what was happening?
Yeah, good question. I think partly there was some frustration. Never with students, that's the part that I always get excited about. But just the mechanics of education and the systems, can sometimes be frustrating. And And yeah, I think sometimes just in the classroom, what we were teaching sometimes felt stale, and finding new materials, and for whatever reason, it just felt like, is this what I want to do? The kids are starting to move out of the house. And so I'm like, this is the time to examine this and figure out if this is what I want to do.
That's fair. But I mean, but in all honesty, I mean, 24 years in any profession, you're going to see a lot of change in that profession. So I mean, like the way students learn from the start of your career to now is very different.
Very different.
The types of students, what they're interested in, what they have access to, and then ultimately the way you have to teach has all shifted and changed.
Yes.
I mean,
very different.
Yeah.
Very different. And that's one of the things I love about it too, you know,
Yeah.
and I love that it's different, and every year is a new challenge, and students are different every year.
So you make the decision. And this is sort of a lifestyle decision here. I mean, it's just before we went live, you said, you know, it's really as intense or more intense than going through your master's program in some ways.
Yeah.
So how do you get started in it? So what's the process? You sign up, you commit to it, and then what happens?
Yeah, I signed up for it. I read a little bit about it, and then was like, I'm just going to do this. And then I started downloading. Yeah, I brought these are all the materials. This binder alone is just all the instructions and things to consider as you go. And it's really overwhelming just trying to keep track of even how do I go about doing this.
Yeah.
So it started just with a lot of reading, trying to understand the principles, similar concepts to the ways I'd thought about education, but some new vocabulary. And then to start moving into, I split it up, did the first 2 components in 1 year and the second 2 components the second year. So then just kind of unpacking how am I going to go about gathering evidence and how is this going to guide my instruction.
So let's talk through some of these components. I have down here component 1, content knowledge. I also put in parentheses, because I got this off their website, a computer assessment.
Yeah.
What's that entail?
It felt a little bit like the SAT or something for teachers.
Yeah.
You know, that was probably the part I was least nervous about, because I everything that I do is really content heavy, you know, in my master's and a lot of the other classes that I've taken over the years. So I felt pretty confident with that, but they do ask, you have no idea what they're going to ask you about, but obscure literature or different literary movements. But the content was also focused around instructional practices. So as an English teacher, one part of my exam was also like, here's student examples of work. What are they doing well? What are they not doing well? What type of feedback would you give? And you're kind of assessed on that part of it as well.
With the portfolio, so component 2, differentiation in instruction, is that what you brought?
No, it's all digital.
Oh, okay.
But it's
a portfolio nonetheless.
Yeah. And that was great. That year, well, that was 2019, 2020.
Yeah.
And so
that's a weird year.
It was a weird year. So first semester, I was mostly just kind of reading through this and getting ideas. And then I decided I would really do my gathering second semester to really put it all together. So you select classes, and then out of those classes, you're trying to show how you differentiate your instruction.
Yeah.
What do you gather? How do you use that to inform your instruction? And so interestingly, you know, we never got fourth quarter.
Yeah, right. I was going to say.
And so things got really interesting that way with how do I still, the few students that are kind of carrying on, how do I still make this happen? But you know, we figured out, and that's teaching. Like, you never know what you're going to get. So I thought it was really authentic that way.
So what are some examples of what you put into this? Like, what are you looking for?
So, like, they would ask for, you know, explain your philosophy or your objectives for a unit. So you kind of set it up around a unit. Here's the unit. Here were my objectives. Here were my pre-assessments. Here were my formative assessments. And then you have to show the evidence that you gathered. So here's the data that I collected.
Yeah. And
then you show how you differentiated your instruction. So I developed these different groups based around their performance relative to these standards. And here's what I did to kind of meet the needs of these students. Here's what I did with these students. Here's what I did with these students. Then you show them in the next tier how they performed on the next level. Then you show how they did on their summative assessment. Yeah. And you're not evaluated based on, did all your students get to proficient, but just like how skillfully did you navigate through that process. And then it's an opportunity for you to be really reflective. And I found that sometimes the way that the evidence that I was gathering, I wasn't really using effectively. And sometimes I was gathering information that I didn't use at all. And sometimes what I was gathering wasn't as clearly aligned to my ultimate standard as I kind of thought it was. Yeah. And so it was really helpful for me to recognize some limitations in the ways that I'd been setting things up in my own classroom. Yeah. Super valuable. Yeah.
So I didn't anticipate even going another layer into this, but what's an example of something like that in your classroom that you've done in the last couple weeks or month? Like what piece of literature are you looking at, and like how would you lesson plan something, for this week or next week, or how does that process that you went through, just that thought process, how are you applying some of that?
Yeah. So one thing we're doing right now, I'm co-teaching a class with Chad Smolik. Yep. Called The Literature of Resistance Movements in American History. And we kind of have a sociology focus on it now, but so we're starting to move into more of a project-based model. Okay. And so we're going to be doing some research with that. And so one of the things we're doing right now is we're just trying to set up, like, what do they know about how to do effective research? Yeah. So we're starting to we'll give them a small piece. So we introduced a concept about a specific movement. Mm-hmm. We're doing the labor movement right now, which is not the most exciting, sexy movement out there, but it's good. It's good. And so we introduced one concept to them, and we're like, okay, here's a concept that appeared. How did we get the 8-hour day? And, so then what are the movements for today? So they just have to do a little bit of research and then record. They're reporting back to us how they navigated that process. And through that, I'm able to figure out what do we know about research, what do we not know about research, what do we know about citing sources, what do we not know about citing sources. Before I move into my next step, which is the big annotated bibliography, now I know, do I need to give direct instruction to everyone, or do I need to develop different groups based around their content knowledge coming in? Yeah. And that way it saves time, everything's more efficient, and I can provide scaffolding for people that need it and not waste the time of those who don't. Yeah.
So how much time do you put into, thinking about where your students are at? So, we're at the point of the year where, you've been around, a lot of students for quite a while. You kind of have a sense of where, some students are at in some areas, not in others. Yeah. But ultimately, they're bringing a lot of previous experience into your classroom. Yeah. And so you're constantly going through that cycle of, some formative assessments, just walk me through what that looks like, on any given day. Because it can change, I'd imagine.
It does change. And since we started a new semester, we're getting far enough in now. We're starting to figure kids out with the new semester. But with my AP students, I've had them all year, but I'm still constantly having to collect data because we're constantly shifting those skills. And so I like to do just a lot of smaller pieces, gather something around, again, kind of a specific skill that we're building towards, thesis statements, something like that. And a lot of times it's just we do a lesson, and then it's just, something they turn in, kind of the old-fashioned, ticket out the door type thing. Yep. Other times I provide something for them, and then they're kind of evaluating it for me. And so it's just a different way of flipping the way that they look at it or the way that they think about it. But it really happens almost daily, even through discussion. Just as they have a task and you go around, and I'll just kneel by every student, check in with them, see how they're doing, have them talk to me about what they're doing. That's a quick, easy way for me to figure out what they're doing, what they need. And then at the end of the period, I'm just writing a quick notes, like, here's what I'm seeing, here's the patterns I'm seeing. Sometimes it's just a few students I'm going to need to pull, and other times it's really clear there's a misunderstanding here that I need to address, something I need to go back and reteach, or that I didn't teach. Sometimes I recognize that I made an assumption, and that now I need to go back and teach and fill that gap in. So,
interesting. How valuable is having those touch points with students, though?
Yeah, so it's everything. The hardest thing about kind of last year was just not having access to my students every day.
Yeah.
And never meeting, probably 20% of my students. I never met them. I never once saw their face. And I don't think I was very effective with them, because just how do you connect with them? How do you get there? And so much of it, too, is making those personal connections so that as you're working with a student on a skill that they don't have, that they perceive at least that everyone else has, everyone else, air quotes.
Yeah, right. Yeah, thank you.
That can be really disarming, like really upsetting sometimes to students. They don't want to feel stupid. They don't want to feel dumb. But through those relationships, you kind of understand, like, how can I come along and build this person up? How can I help them get that skill they need, recognize that they need it without making them feel less than somebody else that's in that room? And that really just comes through those interactions, that daily rubbing shoulders, being real with people. Yeah. And so, those touch points are so essential.
I'm not going to lie to you, you kind of gave me chills there for a second. Your passion around it is incredible. Really. Wow, that's incredible. We're going to come back to that. I have more questions. Component 3, teaching practice and learning environment.
Oof. Yeah.
Video recordings?
So this was last year, and, they were great. The national board, they reached out and they're like, hey, we know this is going to be a weird year. Yeah. And so normally you have 3 years to complete everything. Yeah. Or to pass everything. So most people try to do it in 2 years so that if you don't pass certain sections, you can go back and redo it. Yeah. Anyways. So they said we'll give you an extension if you don't want to do it this year. And I thought about that, and I decided that I wanted to do it this year because I thought it might help me give focus to what I was doing, and it ended up being extremely valuable. It's hard to watch yourself. I don't know, you probably have to watch yourself all the time in what you do.
I try not to, but it does happen.
But I don't have to watch myself very often. I hadn't for years, and so to have to watch myself teach was a challenge. But especially in this environment, if you'll remember at the beginning of the year, we were in hybrid mode. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So we had
feels like eons ago.
Yeah. It feels like 10 years ago. But we had some students that were 100% remote, and then of the students that were coming in, they were in 2 different cohorts. Yeah. So one of the classes that I had selected for this was a class of 26, and of those 26, I had 12 that ever came to the school, and in one cohort I had 8, and in the other cohort I had 4. So a lot of the times when I was doing this videotaping for this class, I had 4 students here and I had 22 students as icons on a screen. Yeah. I had no idea how to do that. I still don't know that I really know how to do that. But I know I got better because I had to watch myself flounder and struggle. And I was able to start looking at, okay, when are my students online engaged? When are they participating too? And when is it they're just all static blobs on a screen and just the students that are present in the classroom are engaging? And through that, I was able to start to see this is more effective than that. And I never would have gotten there without it, because you're so caught up in the moment and so flustered in the immediacy of the moment. Yeah. But I was able to step back and look objectively, and this gave standards that I was trying to look and apply, and I was able to recognize things that were working, things that weren't working. And so I know that I got better throughout the year. Second semester, I was much better, and things had changed a little bit by then too. But kind of through that process of seeing myself and so regularly teach, it was incredibly humbling. One of the most helpful things I've ever done. Yeah.
So the last component, I feel like you probably touched on it here, effective and reflective practitioner. I feel like we're going through that process now a little bit, and you certainly have in depth for this process.
And that was one of my favorite things about the process. It forced me to be reflective
Yeah.
all the time, constantly. And as part of that as well, part of the, I guess, the assignment, the task, I had to go through reflective conversations with other people as well.
Yeah.
And so talking to instructional coaches, talking to ESL teachers, talking to special ed teachers, talking to colleagues, talking to administrators,
Yeah.
showing them what I'm doing, getting their feedback and being reflective with them. Each person that you speak to comes at it with a slightly different lens.
Yeah.
And so I'm learning from each of them, even though I've looked at some of this stuff myself 1,000 times
Yep.
at that point. Seeing it again through their eyes, it brought even more stuff
Yeah.
to the surface.
Well, I commend you for not only going through the process, obviously, again, congrats on the national board certification, but really that's a reflection of you doing the hard work. And it's hard to get feedback from people. It's hard to not just get it, but then to seek it out and then to be able to do it yourself. It's like this weird combination of like you need the confidence to do it, but you also need to be willing to be vulnerable to be able to do it as well. And that's not easy.
Yeah. Well, and the last piece I should have mentioned in that beginning part as you listed those off for me, one of the other big ones is from students. And that's something, I gather stuff from students all the time, but having really intentional conversations with students about what's working and what's not working, who knows better than our students?
Oh my goodness.
So yeah, I love when I'm able to be kind of vulnerable and transparent with them because I ask them to do that every day. And I think it's only right that we do that with them as well.
Yeah.
And I think one of the challenging things for teachers was just how humbling it was to feel like you're an expert at something and all of a sudden all the rules change on you.
Yeah.
That's tough. But that's also how we grow,
Yeah.
That's what I needed. That's what I needed to jumpstart me to kind of rekindle the fire. And
it did that?
It did. It totally did. It totally did. Yeah.
One of the best. So when we refer to students, I mean, you work with high school students.
Yeah.
I worked with high school students for many years. One of the things that I really love about high school students is how honest they can be. Yeah. One of the things that I grew to really appreciate about high school students is they're really good, like they're a good read of people. Like they know instantly whether they're talking to an adult who genuinely cares about them and genuinely, can own their own mistakes, the teachers, the adults, and they gravitate towards that. Like they just, some of them may not be able to like articulate all of that, but they can read people so good. And that was one of the things that I learned when I was teaching high school students is just be straight with them. Because if you're not, they'll know that you're not. No, they fully know.
Yeah.
I love that. Yeah. So I bring this up oftentimes, I bring in my personal life into this podcast from time to time. And, so we have a student or a child of ours who is dyslexic. And so we were going through that process. And one of the things that you said really sparked with me because they said one of the key things about education at this age, and they're in elementary school, is to make school like a success. Like to make it a win. And a win doesn't mean that they have to like be off the charts in the reading or the math or whatever. And so like when you brought up just the touch points and personal connections, that's not bringing that student just into whatever unit or project they're working on. It's bringing them into your classroom. It's bringing them into the school building. And there's just a lot of power in that.
Yeah, every student comes with their own unique sets of challenges. Yeah. And more than anything in teaching, this is what I most value is being able to like work with students and help unlock and help figure them out a little bit. And, you mentioned dyslexia. I had a great model. My father was dyslexic.
Oh, okay.
And not only did he overcome it after being kind of pushed into special ed classes his whole life and told that he could never be anything. I mean, He went on to get his master's degree in reading. He became a reading specialist, opened a reading clinic, you know.
Oh, that's phenomenal.
And so, I mean, I tell students that all the time when I'm working on them, like these things that seem impossible right now, you know, we can conquer them.
Yeah.
And it's not going to all happen overnight, but
Yeah.
it's just figuring out where you are now, and then let's take you a step further. And that's why it's just as important to differentiate at the top as at the bottom,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
And I've got these other kids, you know, right now, they're so much smarter than me. So, like, what am I going to do? I'm just more experienced than they are. So I just need to keep challenging, putting something fresh in front of them. And if everyone's learning something new every day, everyone feels like they belong to this community of learners. And if we value that journey more than we value the product, which is where I think education sometimes gets it wrong.
Yeah.
But if we just understand this process and we're constantly trying to learn and to chase down the things that we're curious about and that we're passionate about, and that's what it's all. That's what I get excited about.
But it is the journey. I mean, isn't it? I mean,
100%.
You know, what does success mean, you know, in your classroom and education? Well, I mean, maybe that's a question for you. What does success mean for the students?
For the students?
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, I mean, that's a great question. That's one we could reflect on for a long time.
Yeah.
And it kind of gets down to that equity piece, what you're kind of talking about, you know, which is something I think we're all wrestling with, how to do that better. But I think success looks different for different people on some level, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and that's what's exciting about it. For some students, I want them to develop their ideas and write more, and others, I'm just like, I want you to cut this in half, you know, right?
Yeah.
But for each of them, I think it's learning that they can do something they feel like they can't do.
Yeah.
And that's what I love for them. Like for them, everyone feels challenged.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, they experience success and feel like I couldn't do something at the beginning, and now I can.
Yeah.
And so I try to get them to be reflective too, so they can recognize their own growth. Especially like in writing, it's hard to see your growth as a writer. But when they go back and they look at early writing from early in the semester, they can see all these problems that early on they were mad about maybe their score that they got. And now they look at it and they're like, oh my gosh, I'm so embarrassed by this. And then they can see and start to recognize their own growth.
Yeah.
They're just so close to it. So I think a part of what it looks like is helping them to recognize their own successes.
Yeah. So how much voice do students have in, I don't know, like their projects and what they're doing? Obviously, you know, you're providing structure. You know, you had talked about one unit that you were looking at. You know, you're looking at labor movement, excuse me. And so then, what do students bring into your classroom? You know, do they have some discretion on routes they go?
Yes, it looks a little different in each class, I would say. In my survey of lit class, they choose every text that they read.
Oh, okay.
They have 100% control over what they read. It can be fiction, it can be nonfiction. They set their own reading goal based on a rate that they've determined based on the text they're reading at that time. In some of my other classes, like my AP Lit class, it's a little bit more split. So sometimes we have a whole class text. Right now, the whole class is reading Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison.
Okay.
We read Hamlet first semester, you know. But then also along the way, they are also doing a project on an independent reading novel.
Yeah.
So they had kind of I had a list of maybe 25 texts, but they could also propose a title of equal literary merit.
Yeah.
You know, from that list. First semester, or I guess later in the semester, same thing. They'll have kind of a managed choice list. So they'll have a handful, maybe 10 choices that they'll choose from. So it kind of depends. In my resistance movements class, right now we're just kind of giving quick hits over a lot of different movements.
Yeah.
And then they're going to be selecting a movement that they want to go deep with. And they're going to spend the rest of the year developing a multi-genre project. It'll be research-based, and they're going to become kind of experts on this and develop a project to kind of share it with the rest of the world. And they have control over what movement they pick, and it just has to meet the criteria of being a resistance movement. Yeah. So we're trying.
What is the criteria?
I mean, just a sustained movement, the advocating for social change. I mean, so pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
And But yeah, I want them to find things they're passionate about. And we do need some mentor text. We need some common text to learn around. And so even, except in that survey of lit class, maybe I'll just have like a short piece every now and again we look at. But that one's kind of an outlier. Most of my other classes, we have some common learning around some mentor text that I use to model the instruction that we're doing. And then they're going to apply it to something that they're interested or engaged with. And hopefully that way they get the learning that they need, but around issues that are more interesting to them.
Yeah.
And then I try to carefully select what we all go through, kind of through the an equity lens and representation and a lot of those other issues.
So when looking at these movements, and really, I mean, maybe reflect over the course of your career, students have way more access to information than you or I did going to high school. I mean, it's just, it's an infinite amount of information, and it's all right there, either on their Chromebook or their phone. How has that shifted, like student engagement in topics? I don't remember being this engaged as a high school student, to be honest with you. Maybe that's a reflection of me. I don't know. But they just have access to so much information. Is that good in some ways? Can it be challenging in other ways? I know it is challenging in other ways.
It cuts both ways, Eric. Yeah, I think it does. In some ways, it's great because I can throw out an issue there, and within minutes, we can have access to really high quality sources from all over the world. Yeah. And it's amazing. But also sometimes with that easy access, there's also kind of a level of almost apathy, and like, why do I need to know this? I can just look it up, or,
which is a little annoying and 100% true all at the same time.
It makes you think like, do they need to know this? Which are good questions to ask yourself too, right?
Yep.
But learning about things and doing something with it, there's value to that. But also it can be a little challenging. Yeah. There's so many shortcuts available online also. Yeah. So like, if I need to know about this book, can't I just read a summary of this book instead of reading the book, Right. And like, no, that's not the point to know what happens. Yeah. It's how it's written. And so there's still some battles like that. Yeah. But I'd say on the whole, there's some great tools with technology. There's definitely times in every class where every computer's away and I don't want them out for any reason. And other times where you have to have it out.
Yeah,
and
right.
It's,
So I have a two-part question here. My overarching question is, how do you choose, some of your text and supplemental materials? And then I am curious about this question, but it kind of sounds a little funny. Do you ever fall into that, well, I'm a high school English teacher, I got to put this on the list. Insert all of the, required, I put in air quotes, required high school readings, which many are wonderful to read. But, there's kind of like that cliche a little bit. How do you choose supplemental, or your text? Does it change over time?
Yeah, it does change over time. It does change over time as philosophies and things change too. One part of the answer that's not a popular answer, but it's an honest one, is we have limited resources. Books are expensive. Sure. And so sometimes it's like we assign books because we don't have a budget for new books. Yeah. And
you have them.
And this is what we have. Yeah. Yeah. And that's not a real glamorous answer though. But we're we're constantly looking at things. I definitely grew up in the school of, the dead white guys, and that was the model I had in college, and certainly the way I started at Ames High. But that is, everything has shifted, everything's changed. And so there's still some pieces that we definitely get in that we feel like are part of Western culture that people need to be exposed to. Our freshmen still read Romeo and Juliet. In my AP class, we still read Hamlet. There's some texts that they just suggest that you read if you want to perform well on the AP exam. So there are certainly some texts like that. But we've definitely been asking some big questions about, what do we put in front of students? This is a big issue in our whole country right now, right?
100% it is.
As who gets to pick what our students read.
Yeah.
And so we think that representation matters. I want students to see themselves in what they're reading. But there's also things I think they need to know about or experience that they're going to understand more of our culture, or illusions that appear all across popular culture if they're a well-read individual in certain things. So trying to find that balance, it's a tough balance. We're always struggling with that. But we do make concerted efforts to buy texts, and our personal libraries are full of books where students can pick something and read, and hopefully find something interesting from a living author.
No,
that
I
looks
get it.
like them. You know. Yeah.
Talk a little bit about, like celebrations in your classroom. It's, you had talked about the labor movement not being the most, attractive thing to cover on any given time, but they get to choose other movements and stuff like that. But ultimately, they have some deliverables, and I liked how you framed. You're pushing students to not only, hey, let's add some more, robust information here, but for other students, let's cut it in half. Do you get those aha moments from students sometimes, or maybe you see some frustration early on that then shifts into, you know what, I powered through that and I did that?
Yeah, there's a lot of great moments as we go. We try. I try to celebrate the things they're doing. Sometimes they just celebrate themselves, through their own reflections.
I love it.
But my classroom, if you come into my classroom, it's kind of a cluttered mess, but it's just full of student work over the years that have been produced. And so we put that out there. I'm big on people sharing the work that they do. I want them to learn to stand behind the work that they do and the ideas that they have. Because we're also, with this technological social media world, we're in a place where people are really big about advancing ideas but not putting their name behind it. Anonymous accounts and
I love
burner
that
accounts and and so I want that doesn't help anything. So I really want them to get to this idea of this is my work, I'm proud of it, this is the way I think, and I'm going to stand behind it. And I think there's something to that. So that is something that we push for.
How does that go over?
Classes.
Do you, in your experience, do students do they get that concept? Because they've lived in a world of burner accounts. I mean, as far as perspective goes, that's just normal. Not saying every student has one, but just the concept of anonymousness. That was, I don't know. I felt like it's maybe a newer phenomenon, with social media, you can just throw an opinion out there and it can bang around, the internet for a while, and there's no accountability.
Absolutely.
So how does that go over then? When obviously it's a safe environment, it's a safe place in your classroom. So how does that concept go over?
Generally well.
Okay.
I think for the most part, kids want that. I mean, I think they want accountability. They like having clear boundaries, I think, is a whole separate maybe conversation. But I think they aspire for that on some level. But then there's also this incredible fear of saying something and becoming ridiculed or targeted because of it. And so that's always a fine line, too. You try to create a culture in your classroom where everyone feels safe to share ideas. But that is something that students are really concerned about. And, we also didn't have to grow up in a world with online bullying.
No, right, correct.
If there was a bully at school, we could leave school and then we were in a safe place again. And they can be in a place where they're never safe or never feel safe. And so that is a very, very real thing for them too. But we just really try to focus on authenticity and again pushing back on ideas and not people. These are ideas that I think we talk a lot about, but honestly they don't have them modeled very often from people in society. They're people that they see online. Certainly from a lot of our government officials and whatnot. It's just not always modeled very well.
No, it isn't. So when they're in your classroom having you engage in obviously dialogue, conversation. You want things to this push and pull. You know, we just talked about the anonymous accounts and how you know you can just say crazy things and without repercussion. Do you feel like students, I mean, like everyone kind of reels it in when you're in person, or do you see, how does that work in the classroom? I mean, you know, like this, there is an art to be able to have conversation and disagree with one another, and then to be able to continue on with our day, you know, like in that conversation. I've always found that that high school students probably in general, can do that a lot better. What's your experience in the classroom?
Yeah, so I frame it as civil discourse.
Yeah.
And I think it's a lost art. And I actually see it way better from our students than I do even from the adults in our building sometimes. If you know, we disagree with one another, it's harder to be gracious with people.
Yeah.
And for some reason, they're more able to do that. Now, they can also turn on people like that in just really crazy ways sometimes. But I think on the whole, they're a lot more willing to do that or have their ideas pushed back on.
Yeah.
And they'll think about it. And I love sometimes in class, some of the great moments that I really try to stop and celebrate when they happen. But sometimes the student will be like, I know yesterday I was saying this, but, and then they'll kind of take a slightly different course the next day. And I love that. I love that they said something and meant it 100% the day before, reflected on it more based on a conversation, and then altered their point of view. That's what I think we as adults struggle with sometimes.
Yeah, 100%.
We just get stubborn. We get set in our worldview, and that's what gives me hope. Is if we can learn to do that, if we can learn to talk about issues, and if we can learn to seek out, you know, valid sources too, you know, and not just have an opinion, but have it rooted in something concrete. That's what we need.
Well, I love the idea of the concept that learning is a process. I think, you know, too often as adults, you know, we read headlines and somebody said this, therefore they have to stand behind that for, you know, eternity. But things can shift, things can change over time. Like we can all learn as we go. Just because, you know, we have an opinion today doesn't mean, you know, like you said with the student, well, that shifted the 24 hours later due to reflection, maybe due to learning something else. It's incredible.
And that's, I think, again, where as a teacher, I have an opportunity to model for them where that happens for me. And so I try to talk to them sometimes about misconceptions that I've had, or my own maturity or my own growth. When sometimes you know, we all have, I think, these blind spots sometimes that we don't see things in a particular way. And then someone will say something and you'll recognize like, oh, you know, like I've been privileged enough to never have to experience that in my life. So it's never occurred to me that would even be a barrier for someone. And now I see that it is. And like, what a great opportunity for me to revise my own thinking, my own worldview. And I think if we model for that we don't have all the answers ourselves, that it's a journey and a process for us as well. Hopefully that invites them in to that process.
I would imagine that's got to be one of the things that you've seen shift the most over your career. You know, education has always had this image of, well, you know, the teacher's up there, they're the authority in the topic, and you kind of reference that a little bit. It's just you're more experienced. You don't have all of the answers, and I think that's okay. Students get that, especially high school students. They get the genuineness, they get the authenticity, and if you can go through that process with them, they're much more likely to go along with you.
I think so. Yeah, I mean, you're right. When I first came in, it was like you don't show any fear.
Right.
Like, you know, the first month of school, you just try to intimidate all your kids into silence, and like
it's horrible.
Straight rows, and you talk the lecture, and everyone takes notes, and just some of the stuff now I look back and I I'm like, what was I doing?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And pretty quickly I just learned that the more I empower my students to be in control of what they learn, the more they learn.
Yeah.
And the more, like, if I'm doing all the talking, there's probably not a lot of learning happening.
Yeah.
So I need to facilitate, but I'm really huge on collaboration. And that's another reason why COVID was so tough, right?
Yeah.
So, but that collaboration piece, learning from each other, I think is so much better. Everyone has a voice in a smaller group. In a large group, a few dominate. Just there's so many things along the way I've figured out. Not that I'm there at by any means, but I feel like I'm in a better place now than I was a few years ago, for sure.
Well, James, I just want to thank you for coming on here. This took so many directions that I didn't anticipate, and I loved every part of it. I will say congratulations to you again. Thanks, on sir. The National Board Certified Teacher. It is a remarkable accomplishment. In fact, when I first caught wind of it, I had a couple people actually text me and say, this is a big deal. So it just it reinforced the fact that not only it is, but the work that you put behind it. So congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, and I hope we can get some more teachers to go through it. Yeah. It was such a valuable process. I think I benefited from it. I know my students benefited from it. It's the best professional development I've ever been a part of, because everything is 100% focused around your instruction in your classes with your students. And anyways.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again.
Yeah. Thanks, sir.